For the 20-hour skill training project, I have decided to improve my ability in juggling a soccer ball using both my feet and my thighs. Juggling a soccer ball is an important technical skill in soccer that improves the player's coordination and balance as well as their ability to control the ball when executing free kicks, corners, and gameplay tactics. The 20-hour project will adopt a constraints-led approach, which is based on the dynamical systems theory and ecological dynamics. This approach suggests that learners are non-linear dynamical systems with a focus on self-discovery, where the learners search for stable and functional states of coordination, also known as attractor states. Complex systems are composed of numerous interacted elements that interact with each other in a non-linear manner to produce efficient movement patterns. This self-organizing system is adaptive and allows for movements to be produced through interactions of degrees of freedom. For this project, the learner is the complex system with multiple interacted elements interacting together to perform the desired skill. These elements include the learner's joints, body segments, and neural and musculoskeletal systems. Degrees of freedom refers to the number of independent parts that can work together to produce fluid movements. In regards to the learner's skill, juggling is a complex movement with multiple degrees of freedom as it requires the control of multiple body segments. In the early stages of learning, the learner will portray stiff muscle and joint linkages where the frozen degrees of freedom become mutually dependent and therefore create rigid movements. Over time, with practice and motor development, these frozen linkages become unfixed and muscle synergies develop. This means there is now more degrees of freedom to allow for efficient and fluid movements when performing the skill. Under Newell's model of constraints, constraints can be defined as factors that limit or enable behaviors from a movement system, and these interaction of constraints forces the learner to desire more stable movement patterns. When juggling a soccer ball, multiple constraints can be manipulated, including environmental such as wind exposure, tasks such as modified goals, and individual such as memory and vision. Under the CLA, Newell's model of motor learning provides a solid framework to understand how degrees of freedom and complex systems can self-organize over time to changing constraints and environments. The first stage of motor learning is aimed at assembling a basic coordination pattern where the learner constructs a rough plan with the available degrees of freedom to create a movement solution. The second stage is aimed at gaining control of coordinated structures by exploring and adapting to new constraints, which enables self-correction and self-discovery. Lastly, the third stage is aimed at skilled optimization of control, which is characterized by the fluidity of movement and the ability to adapt to sudden environmental changes. The goal of the skills training project is to improve my coordination and ability to juggle a soccer ball using my foot or my thigh by completing as many reps as possible in a period of 30 seconds. By adopting a constraints-led approach, I hypothesize that the skills training project will improve my ability to juggle a soccer ball by at least 40% of the pre-testing measures that were measured in the baseline test. For the skill training project, 4 performance assessments will be conducted to measure skill acquisition. The pre-assessment involves the learner juggling a soccer ball using their thighs as many times as possible in a period of 30 seconds. The post-test will be completed at the end of the 4th week and will be the same as the pre-test. The transfer test will involve the learner juggling the soccer ball as many times as possible whilst walking for 10 meters in a straight line. This test was included in the performance assessment to measure the adaptability of the learner. Lastly, the retention test will be the same as the pre-assessment, and this will be performed 1 week after the program to measure skill retention. For every test, any ball that contacts the ground will be marked as an error, and therefore this will not be counted towards the final result. The goal of week 1 was to enhance the learner's knowledge of the skill to assemble a coordinative structure, which was completed through the provided program. This week reflects stage 1 of Newell's theory of motor learning, which is to assemble a basic coordination pattern. This involves the learner exploring their perceptual motor landscape through discovery, understanding the components of the skill, and to get used to the object. The learner first began by researching reputable sources with a step-by-step guide as well as visual demonstrations of how to juggle a soccer ball with the correct technique. The learner was able to enhance their understanding of the skill by gaining information regarding the most effective areas to contact the ball using both their feet and their thigh, as well as the best posture and positions when performing the skill. After this, the learner analyzed the soccer ball, leading to haptic information regarding the weight and size of the ball. This allowed the learner to begin to self-organize into the correct positions to ensure the correct technique of juggling could be executed. The environmental constraints were manipulated to allow for a stable surface in a closed and controlled environment to limit any distractions for the learner. This allowed the performer to focus on the task at hand and to ensure the correct information was perceived. The performer focused on smaller movements by freezing degrees of freedom when completing one juggle at a time. This allowed the learner to self-organize to complete the singular action without overcomplicating the movement. By the end of the first week, some attractor states were developed as a basic coordination pattern was emerging. This was due to the learner's intrinsic dynamics, which were becoming more stable with practice. So the goal of week 2 was to continue the development of a rhythmic movement pattern whilst adapting to different constraints. This week reflected stage 2 of motor learning, which is to gain control of the coordinative structures. This stage also involved the learner exploring perceptual information from the environment, where the learner became attuned to the consequences of different movement patterns. For the second week, the environmental, task, and individual constraints were manipulated to allow the learner to become more adaptive with the skill. The surface and the space of the environment was altered, where the learner engaged in the program outdoors in an open environment on grass. This type of surface is quite soft and unstable, and therefore it will challenge the learner's coordinated patterns. In addition to this, the outdoor environment leads to multiple distractions such as wind, sunlight, various shadows, and ultimately heat, which can affect the learner's ability to perform the skill. The goal of task was also modified by programming both the foot and the thigh in the same sequence. This will challenge the athlete to activate multiple degrees of freedom to alternate from their thigh to their foot when juggling the soccer ball. Lastly, the learner's memory was also manipulated as a functional individual constraint due to practice of the skill in the previous week. Regarding the program, the learner first begun with 12 reps of alternating thigh touches to progress from last week's singular thigh touches. The learner then completed 6 reps of alternating foot touches to progress from last week's singular movements. From here, the learner engaged in alternating foot and thigh touches, which challenged their perceptual motor landscape due to multiple degrees of freedom. At the conclusion of the second week, the learner had progressed the skill through a constraints-led approach due to the successful self-organization of the complex system, leading to the development of the skill under various new constraints. The goal of week 3 was similar to week 2, to continue the development of a rhythmic movement pattern to gain more control over the coordinative structures by adapting to new constraints. This week also reflected stage 2 of motor learning. The environmental and memory constraints were similar to the second week to continue to challenge the learner's adaptability towards the skill. In addition to this, the goal of the task was also modified to provide an external focus by walking whilst completing the skill at the same time. This in turn will broaden the learner's perceptual motor landscape, as multiple degrees of freedom will be used to perform the skill at hand. During the third week, the learner had to complete 10 alternating thigh touches whilst walking for 2 to 5 meters, depending on the number of errors. Following this, the learner then completed 6 reps of alternating foot touches whilst walking for the same distance. At the completion of week 3, the learner was able to gain control of the coordinative structures by adapting to new constraints. This in turn forced the learner to self-organize and utilize multiple degrees of freedom to produce fewer rigid movements and thus enhance their perception-action coupling. The goal of week 4 was to produce highly efficient movements by adapting to multiple constraints whilst enabling self-correction. The session aims included learning how to alternate between the foot and the thigh whilst moving, as well as learning how to perform the skill with limited vision. This reflects stage 3, which is the optimization of coordinative structures, where the learner effectively adapts to the environment and continues to deliver fluid movement patterns. Similar to last week, the goal of task was modified to provide an external focus by walking whilst juggling the soccer ball. In addition to this, environmental constraints, such as an unstable surface due to the grass, heat exposure due to the outdoor setting, and an open environment with multiple distractions were manipulated to challenge the learner. However, to broaden the perceptual motor landscape, vision was limited by closing one eye to enhance the learner's cognitive performance by narrowing their attention onto the task at hand and to minimize any distractions of various environmental constraints. These distractions would be minimized as the learner was closing one eye and therefore wouldn't have full vision of the outside environment. Regarding the program, the learner started with alternating foot and thigh touches, and they also completed the skill whilst walking for 2 to 5 meters depending on errors and the physical ability. After this, vision was limited by closing one eye, where the learner completed 10 reps of alternating thigh touches, followed by 10 reps of alternating foot touches with one eye closed. By the end of week 4, the learner had successfully widened their perceptual motor landscape due to the manipulation of various constraints. In turn, this allowed the learner to provide fluid and effective movement patterns when performing the skill. The weekly results of errors are indicated on the graph, highlighting a dramatic decrease over the period of 4 weeks. The greatest improvements were identified between weeks 1 and 2, where the learner reduced their number of errors by 17 repetitions. This could be due to the learner entering stage 2 of the theory of motor learning. The total number of juggles increased by 10 reps from the pre-test to the post-test. Slight reductions occurred regarding the retention test, which achieved a result of 14, as well as a slight decrease in the transferred test, which obtained a result of 12 repetitions. In the pre-test, there were multiple errors throughout the 30-second period. However, during the post-test, the retention test, and the transfer test, they all achieved a very low error measurement. Under the CLA, it is clear the learner was reflecting the first stage of Noel's theory of motor learning, evident by the large number of errors acquired in both the pre-test as well as the first week of the program. Due to the beginner nature of the learner was unable to engage in the dual task of readjusting their posture whilst juggling the ball with their foot or thigh, and thus the frozen degrees of freedom led to rigid and stiff movements when performing the skill. Between weeks 2 and 3 of the program, improvements in skill acquisition occurred, evident through observation of fewer errors and less rigid movements. This is clear as the learner reflected the second stage of motor learning due to the enhancement of movement patterns whilst adapting to new constraints and learning environments. Through comparison of the performance measures, the program was highly effective in enhancing the learner's skill acquisition. The learner demonstrated the optimization stage of learning as I was able to adapt to various environments and new constraints whilst continuing to produce highly efficient movements. The post-testing measurements reflect my ability to create fluid movement patterns due to the unfreezing of degrees of freedom, and therefore this developed muscle synergies and a strong perception-action coupling. I also demonstrated the ability to engage in the dual task of readjusting my posture whilst juggling the ball to minimize errors. Furthermore, manipulating key constraints is important in altering the performer's perception-action coupling and to broaden the perceptual motor landscape to enhance skill acquisition. The retention test achieved a result of 14 repetitions, and regardless of the slight decrease in comparison to previous measurements, the high repetition numbers of the retention test reflect the learner's ability to perform efficient movement patterns. Due to the fewer reps than the post-test, traditional theories would argue that this could be due to poor prescription and insufficient quality and quantity of training. However, according to the CLA, skills are usually retained longer if they are performed under a wide range of constraints. For the transfer test, the learner aimed to complete as many juggles as possible whilst walking for 10 meters and achieved a score of 12 repetitions. This reflects the learner's ability to self-organize due to a greater perceptual motor landscape. One strength of the program was its ability to enhance self-learning and self-correction in a performance environment. This is because the learner was provided with information of juggling technique in the first week of the program. However, apart from this, no external feedback was provided at all. This ultimately enhanced the learner's ability to self-correct themselves when performing the skill. Another strength of the program is that it developed a wider perceptual motor landscape of attractive states and therefore allowed the learner to develop and perform functional and fluid movements by the end of the program. This was due to the manipulation of task, environmental, individual, and informational constraints, which influenced the learner to self-organize in order to achieve fluid movement patterns. However, one limitation of the program was the task of juggling that included both the foot and the thigh. By including both components of the leg, it may have affected the ability of the learner to improve the skill due to the different body parts used. Therefore, by using either the foot or the thigh throughout the entire program rather than both, it would have allowed for more practice hours to occur on the one body segment and may have enhanced the skill. Another weakness is that the program did not have any specific progression criteria, as progressions occurred based on the duration of practice time. Due to the standardized nature of this approach, there may have been a lack of individuality for the learner, and therefore the correct progressions may have not been applied. Firstly, coaching staff should adopt a constraints-led approach across all training programs as it enhances self-discovery and self-correction. Secondly, coaching staff should also follow Noel's model of motor learning to identify and progress their learners through each stage of the skill acquisition process. And lastly, coaches must manipulate multiple constraints at various stages of a training program to broaden the learner's perceptual motor landscape to improve skill acquisition. In conclusion, by adopting a constraints-led approach, I have improved my ability to effectively juggle a soccer ball due to the manipulation of a variety of constraints. This in turn broadened my perceptual motor landscape and also my ability to self-correct, which ultimately led to efficient and fluid movements.